Amanda.
Good morning, Simon. How are you?
Very well indeed. How are things in the UK?
They are exceedingly windy today. I think we've been blown off the south coast. But apart from that, all very good. We're looking forward to the easing of lockdown measures, and kids have gone back to school and the summer's coming.
All very positive. Okay.
Oh,
who do we have with us today? What's our special guest?
We have Patrick Cannon come back today to chat to us about updates in SDLT. Looking forward to what he's got to say in relation to changes, or if there were any changes in the budget. Well, there were extension of stamp duty land tax. I'm sure Patrick can tell us more. Good morning, Patrick.
That's my cue. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. How are you doing?
Yeah, we're all right. Thank you.
Right. Well, what I thought I'd talk about this morning was the non-resident surcharge, the new 2% that bites on non-resident purchases of dwellings in England and Northern Ireland, because of course SDLT only applies in those countries, although it's likely that Scotland and Wales will introduce a similar surcharge in due course, not to be outdone. And then wind up, I think, once I've hopefully not bored everybody to tears, with a quick update on the case law in relation to multiple dwellings relief, and in relation to the very tricky issue of claiming refunds for SDLT outside of the normal 12-month return amendment period. There's a very complicated series of rules surrounding reclaims within the 4-year period from purchases.
I guess we would expect nothing less than something tremendously complicated.
Well, they've outdone themselves with the new non-resident surcharge in the era of the Office for Tax Simplification. In true Sir Humphrey style, they've managed to achieve the opposite. And if you thought the 3% additional dwelling surcharge was bad enough, this new 2% additional surcharge for non-residents is even worse, particularly when you have to get involved with close companies that are actually UK resident, but have some form of control offshore.
Right.
And the close company provisions that Simon and Amanda will be intimately familiar with are amended in various ways that apply them to the SDLT surcharge on non-residents. And you really do need to take a mogadon and put a wet towel around your forehead in order to get into those amendments. And I sincerely hope that LexisNexis publishes a version of the close company rules that reflect the amendments for the SDLT surcharge, because otherwise some poor junior assistant somewhere is going to have to do the job themselves in order to let the grown-ups try and wrestle with the provisions. Okay, so the non-resident surcharge comes in on the 1st of April. It's been signposted for some time now. The draft legislation was published last year. It was first announced, I think, under Theresa May as a way to raise some money to help finance the abolition of rough sleeping. But other politicians have said, well, it's there really to put off non-resident purchases of expensive London dwellings by adding a 2% rate on top of all the existing residential rates. I mean, frankly, a non-resident buyer of an expensive London property is probably not going to be put off by a further 2%. You know, a week's change in the exchange rate in sterling can often be plus or minus 2%. So it's really a cost factor that is factored into the overall cost of the investment. And of course, as we know, sadly, a lot of the money from overseas chasing expensive London property is what the offshore bankers call grey or black money. It's either tax avoidance or outright proceeds of crime, such as drug money, looking for a safe harbour in London residential property. So frankly, the 2% is just a cost of doing business.
Yeah.
Whether it actually puts people off or not remains to be seen. So a few headline points. I've made the point that the legislation is very complicated. It's in Schedule 9A, or it will be in Schedule 9A to the Finance Act 2003. I think it's currently in Schedule 16 to the Finance Bill. I guess the first point that struck me, and Amanda and Simon, do interject if you have any points or questions, please. I'm conscious that as a barrister, I can talk all day uninterrupted and bore everybody senseless. So, you know, if you do have any questions, feel free. I mean, the first point that hit me, the transitional rules in the new Schedule 9A. Contracts entered into for UK dwelling, well, English and Northern Ireland dwellings before the 11th of March 2020 are not caught. So if you complete a contract after 31 March 2021 that was originally entered into before 11th of March 2020, you won't be caught, even though you're a non-resident. But there's a couple of points to watch out for here for the unwary. First of all, if that contract is assigned or varied on or after 11th of March, then it doesn't get the protection from the charge and it comes into the charge. So a significant variation in the specification, say of an off-plan flat or dwelling, could bring you into the charge.
So just in terms of that as a change to the plan, just I mean, I guess a movement on the you know, off plan is often, especially with COVID, the completion dates are likely to be jangling around as well, aren't they? So you complete on or after the 31st of March 2021.
Yes, you're protected if the contract was entered into before 11th March 2020 and is not being tampered with or subsold or varied or assigned since then. But the other thing about off-plan contracts, which are a great favourite of non-UK resident investors, of course, is that it's very frequently the case that those contracts are flipped to subsequent purchases before completion.
Yeah.
Usually by an assignment or subsale. So if the agent says to the sub-purchaser, you don't have to worry, this is a pre-11 March 2020 contract, that won't be the case if the sub-purchaser or assignee is non-resident, because it comes out of the transitional protection.
Yeah.
So there's a few issues to watch there. The other interesting thing about the non-resident surcharge, and it's a huge, in my view, it's a huge flaw in the rules. It doesn't catch non-resident flippers who don't substantially perform the contract. So a non-resident, say a Hong Kong investor, buys into a big development and with the aim of assigning the contract on before substantial performance, they are relieved from stamp duty land tax under Schedule 2A. And so if the aim is to stop foreign investors driving up UK residential property prices, it fails because the investor will get in at the early stage, and then flip on for a higher price. So they will be speculating. So it's very odd in all this that the rules favour speculators in UK, English and Northern Irish expensive residential property, because they are effectively exempt. So they can flip on to a resident buyer, and the rules have nothing to say about that. They don't bite. Now, the reason for that, two possible reasons. First of all, the government is aware of it, and they know that this sort of operation helps to give UK property developers efficient funding for their projects, because they can raise a lot of money, say a 30% deposit on the contract initially, and that helps to get the development going. The other possible explanation is that ministers are not particularly familiar with how the rules work, and they don't actually realise what's going on. So take your pick.
I think the latter, I think.
Yes, it's probably a case of don't bore me with the detail. When the civil servants try and explain the position, the headline, we're going to help abolish rough sleeping. Great, yeah, let's do that. But Minister, it won't actually stop foreign investors flipping. I'm not interested in that. That's too heavy.
Interestingly as well, it'd be interesting to see what the stats are in relation to how it has actually helped homeless people, and whether or not they have a special homeless people pot that this additional money is going into.
Well, you're talking, of course, about hypothecation, earmarking taxes, which is a great favour in the US, of course, when US Congress men and women sell their votes in order to get tax revenues earmarked for the new bridge in their constituency, which goes on all the time over there. I must admit, next time I'm in Chancery Lane and I see the rough sleepers in the doorway of the family court in High Holborn at night when I walk up to my home from Lincoln's Inn, I'll ask them if they've been assisted by this 2% non-resident surcharge, what their thoughts are on this.
Cool. Carry on, yes.
That was not meant to be disrespectful, by the way, of rough sleepers, who I do know some of them, and they genuinely have reasons for wanting to sleep rough. Okay, now the next point about this surcharge, it doesn't apply to non-residential property or to mixed-use properties, which is kind of odd. But then I suppose the policy is to target expensive UK or English and Northern Irish dwellings. Now, I say it doesn't apply to mixed-use properties. It will do to the extent that the mixed-use transaction involves two or more dwellings, and the purchaser decides they want to claim multiple dwellings relief. Because of course, you'll recall that HMRC recently announced that if you have a mixed-use transaction with dwellings and non-residential property, you can claim multiple dwellings relief on the dwellings, and you pay not the 3% higher rates for additional dwellings, but the minimum 1%, or whatever the applicable residential rates are, because of the presence of the mixed-use property. So the non-resident surcharge only applies in that situation to the extent that you have dwellings consideration.
Okay. So you can buy a house maybe in Kensington and then maybe buy a shop around the corner at the same time?
Yes.
And link the transaction to, would that, yes, in a very simplistic analysis, get around the surcharge?
Yes. Now that's interesting, Simon. That I am now seeing transactions for buyers of expensive London property where the agents, who are household names, are routinely saying to the buyer, would you like to buy a lock-up garage with this?
Yeah.
And we will throw that in. and the seller will sell you the expensive Mews house plus a lockup. In one case, I saw 3 terrace cottages in Wales. Now that works. It doesn't have to be English property. The solicitor said, "Oh, that won't work. It has to be English property." But I think it's non-residential property anyway. It's okay for this effect.
I suppose I could. Oh no. Carry on. I was sticking in my head then.
I did a tribunal hearing recently. The decision is expected next week, and it's currently embargoed, unfortunately, because it's still in draft, but the decision is likely to be out next week, and I'm unable to talk about it in detail. But it was quite interesting during the hearing. We were discussing mixed use, and the judge was looking in detail at the provisions and said to both the representatives, "Doesn't this mean that if you sell an expensive residential property with a lock-up garage, you get the mixed use?" And HMRC's barrister was most embarrassed and said, "Well, it's not my area, I couldn't say." But I got the impression that his lordship was quite pleased with himself for having spotted this savings opportunity. Now, he said it in a way that suggests this was quite a remarkable result, but it is obviously the correct result.
Yeah.
Unless the bolt-on, of course, is entirely artificial, in which case you may be faced with the GAR, which, if it's not too great a diversion at this stage, I should mention I'm dealing with an inquiry at the moment where HMRC are seeking to apply the GAR where the seller added in a commercial activity on a residential property prior to exchange. And the admitted purpose of doing that was to get the rate down. And this has caused, they've taken great umbrage at this and are threatening the GAR. So, this could be an interesting case coming up in due course if we have to go through the GAR procedures and the taxpayer purchaser.
So no previous trading activities or commercial activities at all?
No. But it is a genuine commercial business. In fact, it's a very nice, attractive commercial business, sort of thing that you and I might wish to visit.
Right.
And pay to use. So that's going to be an interesting one. We've got a very aggressive investigator. But I digress. Back to the headline points on the non-resident surcharge. Interestingly, the sale of a garage or a garden without the dwelling is not subject to the 2%. That's a kind of logical result of the fact that the 2% applies to a dwelling and its surrounding garden or buildings. But it doesn't work the other way. So if you just sell off the garage or garden, because the dwelling isn't present in the sale, 2% doesn't apply. That's a slightly interesting quirk.
But I guess for developers, for development, it's quite,
yeah, it's helpful,
isn't it?
The 2% surcharge applies to across all residential rates. So both table A's, that is the basic table A for a single dwelling, the modified table A for an additional dwelling with 3%, the 15% flat surcharge for corporates buying dwellings for 500,000, and in fact, first-time buyer relief when it comes back at the end, I think, of September. That will also have a 2% on the first, whatever it is, 125, 200,000. Now the residence test, not to be outdone, of course, by other departments in other parts of HMRC, the stamp duty people have imposed their own residence test, which is a kind of hybrid of the statutory residence, well, it's actually nothing to do with the statutory residence test for income tax and capital gains tax, but it is a hybrid of the corporate residence test when you're dealing with a company. The residence test essentially for individuals essentially looks at whether you've got a continuous physical presence at the end of each day for at least 183 days in any continuous 365-day period in a total period of 364 days before the effective date and 365 days afterwards. So if that wasn't enough to get to grips with, if you don't meet the 183-day qualifying test before the effective date, i.e. usually completion, but you do meet it in the days afterwards, in the following 365 days, then you have to pay the 2%, but then you can make a refund claim within 2 years of the purchase. So that only applies to individuals.
Yeah.
Corporates have their own residence test, and they're either resident if they're resident on the normal statutory test, so they're incorporated in the UK or managed and controlled the UK, or they're close companies in the UK that are controlled from overseas. Now, when I say the normal residence test for companies applies, it applies, of course, but you have to be non-resident under those tests to be caught, unless you're a UK resident, close company with some controlling element offshore.
Super complex.
It's extremely complex.
Super complex.
Particularly the textual amendments to the close company provisions, which are basically aimed at UK resident controlled companies that are 51% sort of directly or indirectly controlled offshore. Now that leads me, I probably almost said enough about non-residents, but
they also have a 2-year window in order to claim a refund rather than...
Only individuals, not corporates. There's a concession for individual buyers. They can establish UK residence for stamp duty in the 365 days after the purchase by being physically present at midnight.
I can see people trying to buy a property via kind of Scottish LLP partnerships kind of thing to kind of try to get around the rules.
Yes, well, that would be UK resident.
Yeah.
But if you've got a non-resident, Portuguese investor somewhere in the chain and they pull the strings.
Yeah.
Now, I think we should all have sympathy here for conveyancers. How on earth, when they're instructed on a property purchase, even by a UK resident company, how on earth are they meant to work out whether they should be collecting the 2%?
Yeah.
And paying that under the SDLT return? It's impossible unless you have a conveyancer who also happens to have a doctor of philosophy in stamp duty. It's just not going to be possible.
Yeah.
So I could
more
see
work now, aren't we? We're seeing more inquiries now from conveyancers asking us to advise just on the SDLT 1 form.
Exactly. I mean, we're already seeing, of course, requests to advise on multiple dwellings relief, as the conveyancer just won't take the responsibility, particularly as the fee conveyancers charge, subject to enormous competition from other conveyancers. It's just not economic for them to get into that sort of detailed advice.
Yeah.
And they tell their clients, look, either sign a waiver or go off and see Simon Halley and get a reliable written advice that the conveyancer can rely on to claim the MDR. Or in a lot of cases, I see conveyancers says, I'm not going to claim it, but you can claim a refund within 12 months, go after Mr. Howley after the transaction's completed and get him to do the refund for you.
Yeah.
But I mean, that in itself is not a straightforward or easy process.
It's enormously time consuming.
Yeah.
And one of the huge problems with the refund course is that HMRC will normally just issue the refund without question. And then 8 months and 30 days after the refund claim, they issue an inquiry and ask for it back, which causes all sorts of problems with clients because they are often not told about this, or they've gone and spent the money in the meantime. Meanwhile, the refund claim company has said, thank you very much, we've taken our commission, and then puts the client off by saying, no, this is a ridiculous inquiry, we'll see you right. And they drag it out for 2 or 3 years and then disappear. Now, I asked HMRC on one of these claims that I was dealing with myself, why don't they issue a letter? And the reply was very blunt. It was, well, the client's got the refund. What more do you want? You know, we paid the money. And I said, well, it would be helpful to explain to the client that there might be an inquiry. And even just to issue a letter when you make the refund claim, because they pay the refund claim direct to the client's bank account.
Yeah.
So the advisor isn't told. You have to go through the phone menus and prove your identity and all the rest of it in order to find out, you know, the status of the claim. But anyway, so conveyancers are going to be in real difficulties with this charge. And then I'm already getting inquiries from, of all places, Portugal. There's a lot of non-habitual resident EU people in Portugal now. And just to explain, if you move to Portugal and you haven't been resident there before, you used to be exempt on foreign income and gains, including pension income, in Portugal for 10 years, as long as you satisfied their residency test and you contacted the local inspector and got the exemption. And that was very useful, of course. For example, UK pension income under the treaty with the UK and Portugal, as I understand it, English pension income is taxable solely in Portugal to a Portuguese resident, and therefore you could receive your pension, including large chunks of it if you chose to cash it in, free of English and Portuguese tax. I understand that so many Scandinavian billionaires were taking advantage of this, that the Scandinavian countries put pressure on Portugal to lessen the attraction. And I believe there's now a 10% minimum charge in Portugal for the non-resident exemption, but it still compares very favorably with the UK or the Scandinavian charge. Although I think France now is beginning to look less unattractive because I believe there's a minimum charge of 20%. If you do the same thing in France, a social security charge or something. But anyway, I digress. Now, a lot of Portuguese and other non-UK resident but UK connected individuals will be purchasing under the new regime, and a lot of them using UK corporates for various reasons, the UK interest deduction or whatever. So they're going to have to be very careful about whether the non-resident surcharge applies if the company's controlled from from outside the UK. So that was a whistle-stop tour of these provisions. Very complicated and unfortunately more work and expense for property conveyancers.
Yeah, super complex, and I think it's just going to open, I think, to abuse, which will no doubt create more legislation, more amendments, and more case law. So,
well, you can see the potential for tax fraud because non-UK resident simply buys through a nominee UK company, and frankly, in order to catch them out, HMRC are going to have to do an investigation and look for the beneficial ownership. And that can be quite difficult.
Yeah.
If you've got a fraudster operating behind the scenes. So the potential for abuse is wide open. And unfortunately, it penalizes honest foreign investors who accept the charge applies and pays it without getting up to any funny business with nominee companies.
Yeah.
Or indeed nominee UK resident individuals. And we've seen the furlough fraud out of control, of course, with funny companies. I mean, the same potential applies with the non-resident surcharge.
I agree. Well, we'll see what happens, I suppose.
Yes.
I think that the test and trace system will give them a run to their money as well.
Wow. Okay. Yes, I think it's the world's most expensive IT project.
37 billion. Oh, God.
Yes, I mean, you could build a tunnel under the Irish.
Oh goodness.
Anyway.
Well, I don't envy the conveyancers at all. I mean, the only way they can deal with it is via a waiver, because otherwise you would just be you'd be lost in a minefield. I guess
So
they probably need to open open the inquiry so that the people in the tax office can work out their own legislation. They probably need that period of time in order to work out what actually has gone on.
Well, do you know what we need? And somebody listening to this might be astute enough to create one. We need an app, and I'm being quite serious, that actually, has a sort of decision tree. You put in the relevant facts, it asks you the relevant questions, and it tells you whether you're liable or not. Now, it would be horrendously complicated to produce, but in fact, I think I know one person who's probably going to do that. In fact, I'll be speaking to them on a meeting later today. So I might suggest, because that would be quite serious, that would be of great help to conveyancers. They put in the details. Because of course, a lot of conveyancing now, I haven't bought a house for 20 years, but I recently was involved in a purchase of a house by one of my daughters. And conveyancing now is basically done by an app. The price is so competitive that you more or less it's all internet based. And there are actually very few human interactions in the process. And you see this when you turn around and try and get a refund claim and you need copies of the various documents. It's a nightmare getting the conveyancer to forward the documents to you, because the whole thing's app based.
But you see, I find it quite extraordinary that, when I was in private practice years ago now, whether you were buying a flat for 200,000 or a family home for 2 million, commensurately with your income and your stage in life, none of you had that in your back pocket. And yet I could never quite work out why the British public have allowed such a massive, expensive purchase for it to have just beaten down. You'll spend more on your handbag than you will on your conveyancing fees. I found it extraordinary. And the more queries and questions you raise about title documents or planning permissions or regularization certificates or whatever it is, you're actually seen as sort of quite a spanner in the works, because you're not ticking a box. And it's like, well, no, I'm not ticking a box. But I just think it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary system that we've created. To devalue something so important seems odd.
Absolutely. And when you get a conscientious solicitor involved, it's a nightmare for them, particularly with leasehold purchase, because of all the problems with leaseholds. And they're trying to do a good job. And they raise requisitions and queries, and they're just ignored, essentially.
Yeah. And I think that is right. I think you are just, or one is just ignored. And I think when you have, as you've just outlined, such a complex procedure in relation to what is perceived as just filling in a form, or you just fill in the SDLT one, that couldn't actually be further from the truth. And the fact is, for your, you know, knocked down fee, perhaps which you'll also pay away to somebody that's feeding the business into your firm, you know, it's just not, it's not sustainable to have quality people actually doing this work. And you see it time and again as you look at titles and people have, you know, forgotten plans, or they're looking at access rights, or didn't realize that somebody can connect a service across their back garden, or they don't actually have a lease for the garage that's attached to their home. I find it really concerning, and I think, you know, the squeeze on solicitors to do a good job from their regulatory body, you know, it just doesn't fit with the quality of the work that they've got to do, and naturally the public undervalue that service and then think you're making things difficult. But I think it's so complicated, and certainly, as I say, filing SDLTs is just another element. You're just a tax collector.
Well, we see this, the knock-on effect of this in the renewal premiums for solicitors this year.
Absolutely. Isn't it a 20-year, I think 20-year, like it's been the worst for 20 years trying to get PI cover.
Yes, absolutely. Mind-boggling. At the bar, we have a mutual insurance company.
Right.
So we're not faced with these problems. Now, the solicitors used to have a mutual company many years ago when I first started. But that was abandoned and they went, you know, out into the market, and this is the problems they now face.
But I think that is slightly off topic, but I think that is one of the problems though with the obsession with opening up the marketplace. You know, I think there's a difference between being able to, you know, buy your groceries from, you know, an independent, your supermarket and a market stall, and actually you know, employing a professional person to undertake some work for you. And I think that it's yeah, there's an awful lot of people with an awful lot to answer. Not that they ever will.
Yeah, well, no one seems to be able to control it. It's, you know, no one's really there to exercise leadership. Different parts of the market behaving dysfunctionally. Anyway, if there's still time, I was going to follow up with a few words about multiple dwellings relief and refund claims.
Yes, please.
Multiple dwellings relief, there's a raft of tribunal cases coming through, either awaiting a decision or in the pipeline for hearing, all to do with annexes that are actually physically connected to a main dwelling, or whether a bathroom or a kitchen is absolutely essential for there to be a dwelling. So there will, you know, between now and the autumn, be a considerable number of decisions coming through. The Fiander and Brower case is the appeal in that is being heard in early April. That was the case involving the missing internal door between the annex and the main dwelling.
You referenced that when you were on before, yeah.
Yes, that's right. 7th of April, I believe, is the upper tribunal. A slightly tricky case because there's a conflict of recollection between what the owner said in the first tribunal hearing, that there had been a door there in the recent past, and what the learned judge heard, which was that there hadn't been a door there in the recent past. So that's going to be an interesting issue for the upper tribunal. It's normally very difficult to challenge the first tier tribunal on findings of fact. So that's one of the challenges. And then the topic of refund claims. In the past, as you know, you have 12 months to amend the return and claim a refund if you made a mistake or failed to claim a relief, such as mixed use or multiple dwellings. And then you have 4 years if you miss that 12 months. and that's in para 34 of Schedule 10. In the past, since those 4-year rules were introduced in 2012, it seemed to be the practice of HMRC just to treat the 4-year period as a fallback and give you the refund if you'd failed to claim within the first 12 months. But about 12, 18 months ago, they realized they were paying out a lot of money, and they took a good look at the 4-year refund rules, which are very complicated, and they started refusing claims where you could have made the claim within 12 months, but for whatever reason you didn't. And there's a test case called Smith Holmes 9 Limited coming up, which is one of those cases. It's a multiple dwellings relief claim outside of the normal 12-month period. That's going to be interesting in a couple of, well, A, for the principle involved about whether you can claim in the 4-year period if you miss the initial 12-month period. And secondly, procedurally, the judge, HMRC applied to strike out the taxpayer's appeal when HMRC turned down the 4-year refund claim. And unknown to the taxpayer, the judge heard the strikeout application on the papers without giving the taxpayer the opportunity to ask for an in-person hearing by video in these days, of course. So we've appealed that, and we're currently involved in the machinations of appealing to the upper tribunal because the tax tribunal wants to rehear the matter on the papers. And we say, no, this is such a complicated, important matter of public interest. There ought to be an in-person hearing with the assistance of counsel on both sides.
Yeah.
So that's where we are at the moment. But the 4-year period is very much in play at the moment.
Right. Okay. Well, watch this space.
Yes. So that is my sort of relatively succinct, I hope, update on SDLT. I don't know if Amanda or Simon, you have any points that you'd like to?
As normal, fantastic. SDLT is becoming, I think, well, it already was complex. It's becoming more complex. And we're certainly seeing more work coming to us for advice from conveyancers, smaller firms of lawyers who don't want to really give an opinion on the SDLT side or the completion of the SDLT one returns. So it's certainly, and like I say personally, I can see a lot of people abusing the non-residency surcharge and having all sorts of bizarre structures to try and get around it, or to link up transactions that are not really commercially viable just to get around the surcharge. So nice, it's all interesting stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for your time today.
Not at all. As always, a pleasure.
Brilliant.
And I think we're due to meet again in about a month's time.
Yep. Great stuff. Okay, Patrick, thank you very much.
Yep. All right. All
Thanks,
the best.
Thank you.
Thanks.